YouTube, we're talking college sports in the Deep South where college football is king, and on the plains of Auburn, the battle cry is War Eagle. Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart here on the podcast today talking about a little bit of Auburn football. And as always, on this channel, it's always great to be an Auburn Tiger. And once again, War Eagle. Fearless and true, gang, let's go ahead and get the comment section active. And before we get started, go ahead and like this video. Once you hear the content, go ahead and comment whatever you feel is necessary. And also, equally important, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click the button so that you click the bell, so that you can receive all the information every time I go on, probably about 2 or 3 times a day on some days, but definitely a lot of content regarding the Auburn Tigers. Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit more fun stuff. We talked about the logo and we talked about Gus Malzahn and his little situation he's got going on at Auburn. Hopefully he can fix that with some wins this year. And we also talked about Marlon Davidson and, Marlon Davidson, Derek Brown, and Nick Cole, how they got to just step this thing up in order to potentially be the top defensive lineman in the country. But we're going to get back to something that we did a couple of weeks ago, which is the 2019 opponent preview series. And one of my favorite teams to talk about is the Florida Gators. Auburn and Florida, between 1945 and 2002, had one of the more interesting rivalries in the SEC. Now, when we look at this, Auburn leads the overall series 43, 38, and 2. Auburn actually has a current win streak over Florida of 3 games, which includes the big ones in 2006 and 2007, where Auburn actually beat Florida while they were top 5 opponents. But if you look at the 90s, though, Florida dominated the series, winning 7 straight in the mid-90s on into the 2000s, which included Florida beating Auburn twice in 2000. Now, if you notice, there's some years where the two teams that represent one another in the SEC conference, they play each other twice. Obviously, they play each other in the regular season, then again in the SEC championship. Now, it's really hard to beat a team twice, but Florida definitely did that. That year, Auburn actually beat Tennessee twice in 2004. So even though it's a hard thing to do, but it's not necessarily out of the realm of opportunity. Now, during this 7-year span, the 7-season span in the 90s, the mid-90s on into 2000, this was the height of the Steve Spurrier era at Florida, which is one of the more celebrated eras in Florida history. During this particular time, we consider these the somewhat glory days of Florida football, where Florida State won a national title in 1996, and they won 6 conference championships during this particular span. But these two teams met annually between 1945 and 2002. But there were some changes in the SEC, especially the ones that took place right before the 2012 season, where Missouri and Texas A&M were welcomed into the SEC conference via the Big 12. Missouri took their place in the SEC East, and Texas A&M obviously took their place in the SEC West. As a matter of fact, Texas A&M has developed some really nice rivalries in the SEC West since their inception. Missouri has done the same. The only thing this did, though, from a somewhat negative standpoint, is the interdivisional series started to kind of lose its luster, and Florida and Auburn fell into that particular category. So much so, you better really savor this particular game as Auburn takes on Florida October 5th down in Gainesville, because you won't see this game for another 4 seasons. That is the impact that adding those two teams had on this particular rival. Because you probably sit in and wonder, like, why doesn't Auburn play Florida every year? Why doesn't Auburn play Tennessee every year? Because we look forward to those games back in the day. But they don't play each other every year. And it's actually a really big deal when they play each other now, because they don't play each other as often as we had grown accustomed to in the past. Very good rivalry here with Auburn and Florida. Very excited to get this game going, especially October 5th. When you look at it, Auburn and Florida will have played some teams along the way and will be able to solidify some things by the time they meet, which we will talk about a little bit later on in this video. So we're going to have like a little orientation about what Florida has to offer in the 2019 season. Now, we know they had a very, very nice recruiting class within the top 10. Did have some issues with some retention of a few players, which we will mention, like I said, later on. Now, here's the good thing about Florida as they come back offensively. Felipe Franks, which was an embattled quarterback at Florida, he returns as the starting quarterback, obviously with confidence-building victories over Mississippi State, LSU, and Michigan, and he evolved very nicely from the year prior, looking at what he was able to accomplish on last year. Now, if you look at the year before Dan Mullen's arrival, he had about an even ratio when it comes to touchdowns and interceptions. I think it was like 8 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, or in reverse, however you want to put it. Still basically an even ratio. But if you talk about on Dan Mullen's arrival, that trajectory changed for him, where he had 24 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. The good news also for Felipe Franks is he actually has one of the better sets of wide receivers in the SEC to throw the football to. You look at Von Jefferson, Kadarius Toney, and then a very tall 6'5" Trayvon Grimes. And, another great thing is you have a solid running back returning in LaMichael Pirine. Very, very effective, 900 and something yards last year. And he's kind of good out of the backfield. He's very good at catching the football. He also sells those zone reads that Dan Mullen likes to run. So I think as far as skill players, if you look at the skill players, if you're running 7-on-7 skeletons, Florida beat anybody in the country. The only issue that I have right now, and which a lot of the media outlets have with the Florida Gators and how successful this offense can be, is looking at the offensive line. This could be a potential Achilles heel for Florida because they're losing 4 starters along the offensive line. And when you talk about competing on a high level in the SEC, especially on the level that the media expects Florida to compete on, offensive line play is going to be very, very important. But potentially good news for Florida is by the time the Auburn Tigers roll into town, which would probably be one of the better defensive lines that Florida will compete against, they will have had some time against some somewhat quality opponents to get everything together by the time the Tigers roll around. Now, one part about this Florida team that, should excite the Florida fan base is the fact that they return Todd Grantham. And that was huge for the Gators, because if he wouldn't have returned, you're talking about having to start over with, a pretty good defense. But at the same time, when you look at Todd Grantham's schematics and the way he likes to take some chances, and he's very aggressive on defense, you definitely need an experienced guy like him, especially coming into a season like this. So if the Florida fan base is not excited about this, I'm going to bring this to your attention. Remember the name Todd Grantham, your defensive coordinator, is going to play a huge role in the outcomes of this defense. If you look at the 2018, Florida's defense only allowed 20 points per game on the way to a 10-3 season that ended with a 41-15 win over the Peach Bowl. One of the detractors, though, to the Peach Bowl is that there were key difference makers missing on this particular team. You're talking about Devin Bush, linebacker, Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, decided to sit out. Karen Higdon, Michigan's leading rusher, who sat it out. And also right tackle Juwan Bouchel-Beatty also sat it out. It was to the point, guys, where there was a 7.5 point spread in Vegas, but with these guys being absent, it dropped the point spread to 4.5. That was the implication of these guys being missing, and Florida took very, very much advantage of that. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't have taken that bet anyway. You're talking about I'm not a betting guy, but you're talking about a 4.5, win max with a over under of 52. I'm not betting on that. And like I said before, the defense for Florida seems to be the most solid as it relates to, squads. I think if you compare the Florida offense and confidence you have in them and Florida defense and the confidence you have in them, like I said, I'm not a betting man, but I'm rolling with the Florida defense as being an anchor, at least early, until the Florida offense can establish the offensive line. And hey, the offensive line could gel, but that's just one of the question marks. One thing we do know is Florida has a very, very huge game in week 0 where they take on Miami. And Miami is, kind of recovering a little bit, coming off a 28 recruiting ranking. New head coach Manny Diaz adding some excitement down there. But Florida should be a favorite in that game. We'll talk about that particular game a little bit more next week as we get into week 0. Now, the defense is definitely the more experienced portion across the board for the Florida Gators. One of my favorite players on this team is C.J. Henderson, a very, very instinctive cornerback, should be an All-American quarterback. Cornerback. He actually converted from wide receiver. I think it was either wide receiver or running back to the cornerback position. Had a great season last year. And you talk about Marco Wilson at that position as well. David Reese, which should provide some stability at the linebacker position. Zabari Zuniga and Jonathan Greenwood, both edge players, and both of those players play very well, very solid. Nothing like show-stopping, but very, very solid football players. And then you have Amari Burney and Broad Stewart that even out the defensive backfield for the Florida Gators, who, like I said before, only allowed about 20 points per game and were very competitive down the stretch, including that stretch that led them to a 10-3 season on last year. Now, with some of the holes that may be potentially seen on this defense, they do have 7 players coming back. But Florida could actually borrow from a very, very good recruiting class from last year. Although Florida had a number 9 recruiting class, like I said before in some other videos, Florida was very middle heavy. And this is where the rosters are built. 97, 96, 95. Then you taper off to about 92. Then 90. Those actual ratings, that 4-star is such a big disparity between the 4-star recruit. No 4-star recruit is created equal, because you have the high-end 4-star recruit that's probably just one stellar game away from being a 5-star recruit. And then you have like the lower 90s 4-star recruit. Now, Florida did a very good job of tightening up. I call it tightening up the middle. And included in that middle was a very heavily recruited linebacker, ironically, from Auburn, Alabama, Mahamoud Diabate. Just literally walking distance from Auburn University. As a matter of fact, when I was living on campus, I lived like right down the street from Auburn High School. And literally the recruiting process for this guy would not have been much of an effort for the Auburn Tigers, but decided to take his show to Gainesville and the Florida Gators. So Florida could possibly borrow from a very, very good recruiting class, a very, very defensive heavy recruiting class to help supplement any holes that they may have on the defense. Of course, they lost Chris Steele during his, he actually played spring ball at Florida, transferred to Oregon, now just got waived to play football at USC. How that works, that's beyond me. But anyway, as we continue to talk about the Florida Gators, we have to look at the schedule as they approach the Auburn Tigers and how this could kind of go. Now, before Florida faces Auburn, they got Miami, University of Tennessee Martin, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then Towson. This is a pretty good deal for Florida because with the question marks on the offensive line, it gives them some time against some quality opponents, getting those quality reps. Hopefully injuries won't start to take a toll on them. But by the time they come to the Auburn Tigers, some questions will be answered as far as how the offensive line will play down the stretch, because looking at the schedule, Auburn's defensive line is going to pose the most challenge up to that point easily for the Florida Gators. And definitely the Florida Gators better have it together by then, because Marlon Davidson, Derek Brown, Nick Cole, TD Moultrie, Kevin Steele, the defensive coordinator, also Travis Williams, the co-defensive coordinator for the Auburn Tigers, will have started or at least finalized gelling how the defense is going to look. From the defensive line to the linebackers, and of course the secondary seems to be kind of solid. But the biggest question marks for Auburn is the box. The defensive line, not necessarily talent-wise, but just where everybody's going to be. So by this time, you look at Auburn's schedule, where Auburn will have had Oregon, Tulane, Kent State, Texas A&M, and Mississippi State by the time they come to town to Florida. Definitely those areas should be solid by that time. Another question mark as we flip the ball over to Auburn as they approach Florida is, where will the offense be by this time? We know going into the season, you're talking about a Bo Nix and Joey Gatewood quarterback battle. Experience, but an offensive line that just had a lot of struggles last season. Where will these guys be by this time? Of course, Auburn has the challenging matchup to begin the season against college football playoff / Pac-12 / college football playoff hopeful in Oregon. Of course, all of the answers, of course, won't be in the first game, because you're getting so many kinks knocked out. The quarterback, you may even have a situation where Bo Nix starts at quarterback and then Joey Gatewood has to come in, or vice versa. The offensive line may not have gelled all the way by that time. But when you talk about the games that are after the Oregon game, it gives Auburn time. Kent State and Tulane gives Auburn time to get ready for what media considers to be a treacherous stretch in the SEC between Texas A&M and LSU. Florida, if everything falls into place, Florida will be a nice checkpoint for both teams to see how they're going to look or where their positions are going to be down the stretch. Because of Auburn's experience factor, I feel like Texas A&M and Mississippi, as far as, we're not going to talk about Oregon today, but I'm talking about as far as beginning of the season, SEC games, I think Texas A&M and Mississippi State are much more winnable games than people would like to project. Because you got some media outlets that say Auburn, on the low end would go 6-6, and they're picking the over-under of about 7.5 to 8 games for the Tigers. But I beg to differ, because the reason why they're picking, say, 7 or 8 wins is because they're assuming potential losses to teams that I don't think Auburn should lose to. I don't think Auburn should lose to Texas A&M or Mississippi State, and for that matter, honestly, Florida. Because when you look at the experience of the Auburn Tigers on both sides of the football field, ad nauseum, we talked about Gus Malzahn and his results in calling plays. This is a game that Auburn should win as we talk about the Florida Gators. More experience. Definitely, if that defense is clicking on all cylinders by the time they roll into Gainesville, you're talking about potentially 2 undefeated teams, or maybe at worst, a 1-loss team. The only loss I see Florida having in between Auburn is potentially a upset against Miami. I don't see them losing the other games coming into the Auburn game. Auburn, the only loss that I could just about, I don't think they will lose this game, but the only game that I'm just really on edge about is the Oregon game, because I just really don't know how good these guys are. If you look at the Oregon, their media outlets, and you listen to their fan base, i.e. Derek Luke, big shout out to Derek Luke, one of the subscribers out of Oregon, to hear them tell it, man, Oregon is going to be awesome this year, college football bound. So I just can't wait for the Advocare Classic to really see how good Oregon is going to be. Now, I wouldn't want to play them next year when that recruiting class that they just had this year start to fall into place. But just on the outside looking in, I see this as a very successful season for Oregon. But I'm just not quite ready to get on the college football playoff train yet. Just not. I just don't think a team turns around that quick. But hey, I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But that's the game right there that I'm a little on edge about as it relates to the Auburn Tigers before they reach SEC play. But it is not out of the realm of opportunity with the experience that Auburn has to possibly go into the Florida game without a loss. And I think that would be huge for the Tigers. Definitely could garnish a visit from college football game day once again. They got the one here against Oregon. College football game day will be there. And, I think this is going to be a huge game for the Tigers, a huge game for the SEC. Definitely always a great atmosphere when Florida plays against Auburn. So we'll see how it turns out. Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart for the podcast today. We're talking a little bit about the Florida Gators, who feel like they have rebuilt and rejuvenated that program. We will see October 5th as the Tigers take on Florida Gators. Once again, like I said before, Kennard Vernon Stewart here for the podcast. As always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger. Like, comment, and subscribe to this YouTube channel, War Damn Eagle.